أعوذ بالله من الشيطان الرجيم بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم الحمد لله رب العالمين الصلاة والسلام على أشرف الأنبياء والمرسلين اللهم صل وسلم على سيدنا ومولانا محمد وعلى آله وصحبه وسلم يا فتاح يا عليم افتح لنا فتحا قريبا السلام عليكم ورحمة الله وبركاته. I hope everyone is doing well, inshallah. Alhamdulillah, we completed our first chapter of the book, which was regarding the importance of studying the science of Waqf. Before we do anything, we need to understand the proofs from the Quran and Sunnah, which explain to us why it is something that we should study. Okay, and I hope everyone did the review questions. Please remember that the review questions are at the end of each chapter. Sometimes they'll be like on the last page of the chapter, but they are in the book, and each video will have a link to the answer key as well. So you can do them on your own first, and then you can look up the answers in the answer key. All right, so inshallah, let's start today's lesson, which will be on the terms and definitions in the science of Waqf. All right. Something that is a little tricky here is that, and I will point it out, inshallah, as we move along. And I think that if you have a hard copy, it always helps to add numbers, right? That although it's written as like one paragraph, there are several parts to that definition. So I will point out each part to you, like this is part 1, part 2, part 3, part 4, okay? Various points that are part of the definition of a particular term. Why is this important? Because in every science that we learn in the deen and every Islamic science, what we have is we have, words that have a particular meaning in the Arabic language, but then they are used in a particular way in the science that we are studying. And when they are mentioned in the books of that science, then they're being used in their technical definition, not necessarily in their linguistic definition. Okay, so that's very, very important, because sometimes people can misunderstand a particular rule or a particular concept in the science of Tajweed or in the sciences of the Quran, because they are focused on and thinking about it only when in its literal meaning, and not necessarily in its technical definition that the scholars have given it, and in which way the scholars are using it. Okay, so it is very important for us to make that distinction and to memorize the technical definitions of every term in all the sciences that we are studying. Okay, all right. It is through the science, it is through the study of this science that we come to know the places of Waqf and Ibtida in the Quran. All right, so what exactly does the science teach us? It teaches us what are the places of stopping, and then what are the places where we can start from again. The science of Waqf and Ibtida deals with where it is appropriate to stop and start one's recitation such that the meaning is intact, and also how one should stop and begin one's recitation. So where will be, for example, this is a place where it is good to stop and the meaning is complete, and this is a place where it is not appropriate to stop because now the meaning is either incomplete or is inappropriate altogether. Okay. And then the how to stop is things like, for example, you drop the last haraka, you drop the last vowel and put a sukoon on that letter. Or, for example, whenever you have two fatha tanweens, you stop by making an alif. That is the how of stopping our recitation. Generally, books of Tajweed focus a lot on the how, and the classical books of Waqf focus a lot on where. Okay? Before moving into further discussions within the science, the following terms need to be defined. What is the definition of Waqf? The word Waqf is a gerund masdar of the verb waqafa, yaqifu. The plural of Waqf can be both wuquf and awqaf. Usually in the science of Waqf, we use wuquf. Okay, awqaf is usually used in terms of endowments, etc. Which is not something we study within the science that's studied, I think, under fiqh. Its literal meaning is to come to a stop or a standstill. Okay, so that is its literal meaning. And remember, as I mentioned to you before, yes, there's a reason why the scholars chose this word, right? Because yes, we are coming to a stop. but it has a technical definition within the science, okay? So to think of it as only to stop will prevent us from understanding how it differs from the other terms that are used. Its technical definition is, so this is part number one, the cutting off of the voice. Okay, so basically you stop reciting, the cutting off of the voice. That's part number one. Part number two is at the end of a word. So waqf cannot be made in the middle of a word, right? That is not adjoined. So this part is from Fawaid Makkiyah. It's not necessarily in the other books that I took the technical definition from. And we will understand this a little bit later, inshallah. But basically the word at the end of a word that is written as adjoined. So sometimes there are words in the Quran. So for example, Ya Musa, okay? So Ya Musa is written in a way in which it is one word. The Ya is joined to the word Musa. We cannot make waqf at the Ya. We have to stop at the end of Musa. Okay, so basically, that is what it means, that the word is not at the end of a word that is not adjoined. Okay, that is not adjoined to something else. For the normal duration of taking a breath with the intention of resuming recitation. So then part number 4 would be for the normal duration of taking a breath, okay? And the last part, which is part number 5, is with the intention of resuming recitation. So these are 5 parts of waqf. Remember that this part that is not adjoined, it might be left out of other definitions, and that's fine, okay? There's a whole bunch of different references here for this definition. Then waqf cuts off a word from what comes after it. I really liked this part of the definition because this definition or part thereof clarifies how waqf on a word can affect the meaning. Just as waqf cuts off one word from what comes after it, it also disrupts the connection in meaning between the word on which waqf is being made and what comes after it. Waqf can be made at the end of an ayah or in the middle of it. However, it cannot be made in the middle of a word. All right, so we need to remember that. And where are we getting that from, other than the fact that, there's other than our references, and the scholars have put it in the very definition of waqf, that it cannot be made in the middle of a word, it has to be made at the end. So it is a cutting off of the voice at the end of a word. Okay, so these are the 5 parts of what waqf is. Then the next term that we're going to define is the term sakt. The word sakt literally means silence or to fall silent. Its technical definition is the cutting off of the voice for a time less than waqf, okay? So waqf was for the normal duration of taking a breath, but sakt is shorter than that. Without taking a breath, and this is the main thing that differentiates waqf from sakt, is that you do not take a breath in sakt with the intention of resuming recitation immediately after. So while waqf here had 5 parts of its definition, sakt has 3 parts. So it is a cutting off, actually 4 parts, cutting off of the voice for a time less than waqf. That's 1 and 2. And then without taking a breath, with the intention of resuming recitation immediately after, that is part 4. Unlike waqf, sakt can be made in the middle of a word or at the end of a word, okay? What does it mean that it can be made at the end of a word, or in the middle of a word? So an example, for example, is in the qira'ah of Imam Hamza, or even in the riwayah of Imam Hafs from certain other turuq, there is sakt in the middle of the word shay. So you can say shay, okay? Like that. There are 2 types of sakt. All right, so with waqf, we only had one kind of waqf, and it had 5 parts of that definition. But with sakt, we have 2 kinds of sakt, lafzi and ma'nawi. So sakt lafzi means that it has to do with the word and clarifying something in the word. Ma'nawi, it means that sakt has something to do with the meaning of the ayah or of the word. So sakt lafzi is done to clarify the sound of hamza and occurs when a sakin letter is followed by a hamza. Okay, like for example, al-arub. Okay, so also adabun alim. All right, shay'an, shay'un. Those are all examples of sakt lafzi. And it is done in order to clarify the sound of Hamza. Hamza, there's a lot of rules for Hamza in the, if you look at it cumulatively across the various qira'at, okay, and it all comes from the same reason, which is that Hamza is considered a difficult letter to pronounce. So various Arab tribes at the time of the Prophet ﷺ had various ways of clarifying the Hamza or making the Hamza easier to say. Okay? There are various scenarios in which this occurs in the Quran, and how it will be applied will depend on the qira'ah, riwayah, and tariq one is reciting in. So like I mentioned to you, that even in some of the turuq of Imam Hafs, there is sakt lafzi, okay? Sakt lafzi takes the ruling of wasl and not waqf, all right? So what does that mean? That it takes the ruling of wasl. It means that, for example, the example I gave you of adabun alim, what happens when we make waqf? If we were to make waqf on the word adabun, it would become adab, right? We would not read the tanween at all. However, in sakt lafzi, because it takes ruling of wasl, you say adabun alim, you read that tanween, okay? Now, sakt lafzi is not something that we will concern ourselves with in this book, right? That is something that, we concern ourselves with in the books of qira'at and etc. Okay. However, the one that we are going to be talking about is sakt ma'nawi. Sakt ma'nawi is applied in 4 places in the Quran in the riwayah of Imam Hafs from the tariq of Ash-Shatibiyyah. In each of these places, making wasl could cause an unintended meaning. These are as follows: after the word iwaja in the first ayah of Surah Al-Kahf, after the word marqadina in ayah 52 of Surah Yasin, after qila man in ayah 27 of Surah Al-Qiyamah, and after bal in ayah 14 of Surah Al-Mutaffifin. In the instances in Surah Al-Kahf and Surah Yasin, waqf is also permissible due to the meaning being complete. However, sakt is required if one were to not make waqf there. The sakt will be for the duration of 2 counts. Okay, so about 1 alif or maybe a little less than an alif. That is the duration of sakt in this situation. So it is important, and this is something that I will emphasize again and again, all right, that what we're saying here is that this is the possible reason, right, or the reason for why sakt is required here. However, it is not haram to not make sakt there, okay? What do I mean by that? It depends on the qira'ah or the riwayah that you're reciting in. So yes, for Imam Hafs, you have to make sakt there, right? The sakt is wajib. However, if we overemphasize this, or we kind of get a little overexcited about this, right? That like if you don't stop here, then the meaning changes and then it becomes like this and that. Then how do you understand those qira'at which don't have sakt there? Like, what were those imams doing, right? So everything has to be put in its place, right? So we have to understand that, yes, this is wajib in the riwayah of Imam Hafs. This is the reason why. But it is not that the qira'at that don't transmit the sakt are wrong, okay? So I just want to clarify that, inshallah. Qatr. So that's the next term, qatr. It literally means separating, dividing, or severing one thing from another. Its technical definition is to stop recitation without the intention of continuing recitation, such that the reciter moves on to a different task. Qatr cannot be made in the middle of an ayah and can only be made at the end of it. And this is pretty important. But Ibn al-Jazari, rahimahullah ta'ala, shares a narration from Abdullah ibn Abi al-Hudayl, a great tabi'i, stating that the Sahaba radiallahu ta'ala anhum used to dislike that they read part of an ayah and leave part of it, regardless of whether they were in prayer or not. This is mentioned as an explanation for why qatr should not be made in the middle of an ayah. Okay? So whenever you're stopping recitation, stop it at the end of an ayah. Meaning, now interestingly, in English, I use the word stop, but you can make waqf in the middle of an ayah, but not qatr. Okay, so when resuming recitation after qatr, the isti'adha should be recited. While qatr differs from waqf, it comes under the ruling of waqf. Therefore, all the rules of how waqf is made will apply to it. It differs in terms of where qatr can be made. Okay, how does it differ? Because qatr should be made at the end of an ayah, and waqf can be made in the middle of an ayah. Okay, that is how it differs. And it also differs, it differs in that way. Why? Because in waqf, the intention is to resume recitation, and in qatr, the intention is to no longer, you're done reciting. Okay, so the difference is, for example, I'm reading, let's say I'm reading the Quran, so I am, like reciting Surah An-Naba, and I'm reading. So I'm reading Bismillahir Rahmanir Rahim, Amma yatasa'alun, 'anil naba'il 'azim, alladhi hum fihi yakhtalifun. Okay. So when I stop at yakhtalifun, or I'm stopping at the end of the ayat, this is waqf. But at yakhtalifun, like I just did now, I'm making qatr. I have completed my recitation. I don't intend to complete the recitation of the surah. Okay, so that is the difference between waqf and qatr. Qatr obviously can also not be done in the middle of a word, just like waqf cannot be done in the middle of a word. So I hope that's clear, inshallah, the difference between the three terms that we covered. The reciter may also find himself or herself in a state between waqf and qatr, where the duration of the stop is longer than the normal duration of taking a breath, and yet the reciter intends to continue his or her recitation. So it differs from waqf because it is longer than taking a breath, and it is different from qatr because you do intend to continue. Due to the first aspect, it does not conform to the definition of waqf, and due to the second aspect, it is not qatr either. Books of waqf in Urdu refer to the state as sukut. Okay, so I want to clarify this, that the reason why you may be wondering, like, why didn't I just put sukut, right? Why am I putting it as a note? Because this is not a term that I found in the Arabic books of waqf, okay? However, these rules are there. This discussion and conversation is there, except where you find it is in the chapter of isti'adha. It's the rules of, like, when do you have to renew your isti'adha? But, the scholars of South Asia just decided to come up with a term for it, and that works. And I'm sure it is possible that there is some other text that they were referring to where they got this from, and I just, with my limited research, did not necessarily find that. This can occur due to excessive coughing, to explain or ask regarding a matter related to the recitation of the Quran, waiting for your turn to recite during a group recitation, or getting up to refer to the Mus'haf or books of Tajweed, Tafsir, or other Quranic sciences. The rules of how waqf should be made will apply in this situation. Okay, so for example, this happens a lot when we're teaching Quran, is that a student is reciting to us, we stop the student, and we ask them a question. We say, for example, like, what is the rule here, right? Or we explain something to them that, in the riwayah of Hafs bin Tariq of Shatubiyah, there are two options here, right? Et cetera, right? And we're giving them an explanation. But our intention is to resume recitation, okay? So those are all examples. The rules of how waqf should be made will apply in this situation. So you will still follow all the rules of, stopping by putting a sukoon on the last letter, or, making the ta marbuta aha, all of those things will still apply. As long as one does not turn their attention or conversation to something unrelated to the Quran, the reciter may resume his or her recitation without having to repeat the isti'adha. Okay, so the whole issue here is, all right, after waqf, we do not have to repeat the isti'adha, right? We're all very clear on that, inshallah. But after qatr, we do. So if I, for example, completed my recitation and then I want to sit down like 5 hours later and start up again, I have to read the isti'adha now, right? So in this situation, what is the question? The question is, does the reciter have to repeat isti'adha? And the answer is, it can be yes or no. And so if the reciter's attention or conversation turns to something unrelated to the Quran, okay? Even if it is to respond to a salam, the reciter should repeat the isti'adha before resuming his or her recitation. So, for example, this happens a lot when you teach little ones, all right? So you might stop them from reciting in order to ask them what a particular rule means. But then, while explaining the rule to you, they remember something that happened earlier that day or yesterday at school or whatever, and they need to tell you, okay? So in that situation, then they need to read the isti'adha again, all right? And one of the ways that I used to kind of use this rule actually as a motivational technique was I used to teach a group of teenage girls, and mashallah, that they're at an age where they're chatty and they have a lot to share, and it's not always on purpose. Like, they don't purposely turn the conversation away from the Quran. It's just something that happens. So I would tell them, today we're going to try to complete our lesson with one isti'adha, okay, with one a'udhu billahi minash shaitanir rajim. So that meant that they would try their best to not let the conversation turn away from the Quran, all right? So if you are a teacher of young children, you could always use this rule in that way. Now, as long as you are discussing the Quran, like for example, an ayah is read and the teacher wants to stop and give the students an explanation of the ayah, right? A tafsir of the ayah, or, has a reflection on the ayah, okay? That is still about the Quran, and that's okay, all right? However, there's something really important here that my ustad would emphasize a lot. Is my teacher Qainat Mustabih Tanvi, Hafidahullah, while teaching me the concept of sukut, emphasized that the rules pertaining to sukut are for the purpose of expressing the majesty of the Quran. They help us to remember that the book of Allah is unlike any other. However, if one were to not follow these rules, it would not be haram or sinful in a shari'i sense. Okay, so this is an issue of this is what is better to do in order to have proper adab with the Quran, right? Is that you were reading the Quran and you turned around and you changed the conversation to something other than the Quran. So you should say, A'udhu billahi minash shaitanir rajim again, right? However, and I mentioned to you, okay, how you can emphasize this rule to the kids and actually use it as a motivational technique in your classes. However, there are times when we have to remember that this is an issue of adab, right? So for example, I'll give you a different teaching setting, right? Which is that you have a mother of a young child who is reciting to you. And this has happened to me a lot, right? And depending on the age of the child, sometimes, the mother's recitation has to stop for a little bit because she has to go do something for the child, right? And sometimes, if the child is a little bit older, it may be a very stress-free situation where, all right, I just need to give the kid a snack and now I'm back. And sometimes when a child is young, it is a stressful thing for the mother because she's trying to be present in class with her teacher and respect her teacher's time, while at the same time she has this responsibility. So when she returns, sometimes she's flustered. So that is not necessarily the time. If she remembers isti'adha, alhamdulillah, but if she doesn't, it is not necessarily the time when you need to be super strict about it. And, you have to have hikmah when you are, asking your students to apply certain things. So we have to remember this, that, and this is why I put that as a footnote, because one of the things that Alhamdulillah, Mufti Umar also emphasized with us in the way that he taught us, and Qari Najm does it in a very straight, he actually tells us this, right? Is that we have to know where each one of these rules falls within the science. Sometimes students of tajweed and qira'at, etc., they don't understand where that particular thing fits into the broader picture. And so they emphasize everything with their students. But sometimes that can cause difficulty for your students about things that, are not actually an issue of halal and haram, right? So one has to use their hikmah. One has to understand, okay, how important is this? How is my student doing? Maybe I can let this go today, okay? Ibtida, its literal meaning is to begin something. Technically, it means beginning recitation after waqf or qatr. So both, whether you are stopping after you stopped in the middle of an ayah, or whether you are, starting after you're starting again after you stopped in the middle of an ayah or at the end of an ayah, or you are starting again after you had completely ended your recitation. It has its own rulings in terms of where one can start from after stopping and how one should start after having stopped, which will be discussed later in the book, inshallah. Okay, so these are the terms. It is very, very important that, inshallah, we memorize these terms. And we memorize their technical definition, not their literal definition. All right. So these are review questions at the end of the chapter. And I would really, really like you guys, especially this week, please take time to do them, because you need to see how these things are differing. Now, I put 4 elements instead of 5. That's because most of the books of Waqf mentioned those 4 elements, okay, not the one of the adjoined bit. Although that is assumed because they say at the end of a word, they kind of see those 2 things as the same, okay? So whichever way you put 4 or 5, it's all fine. How does Sakt differ from Waqf? All right, how does Qatr differ from Waqf? These are all important things to sit down and review, okay? All right, so we'll stop here, inshallah. Subhanaka Allahumma wa bihamdika ashhadu an la ilaha illa ant astaghfiruka wa atubu ilayk. Allahumma salli wa sallim ala sayyidina wa maulana Muhammad wa ala alihi wa sahbihi wa sallim. Assalamu alaikum.